work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in. We're back creating, reporting from the quarantine. This is turning into season 1.5 of the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast, the COVID Files. On season 1 of the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast, we set out to use the Upper Harbor Terminal redevelopment project in North Minneapolis as a window into the capitalist economy in Minneapolis and beyond. In season 1, we talked about the urgent need for public housing, the failure of the private for-profit housing market to meet the needs of working class people. We talked about the everyday violence of the Northern Metals recycling plant and the GAF shingles factory, filling the air in North and Northeast Minneapolis with toxins that were attacking the lungs and livers and bladders and brains of our families before COVID-19. We traced the money driving the gentrification of Minneapolis back to the local ruling class, to a family of billionaire inheritors set to profit off of public land in North Minneapolis. On season 2, we plan on continuing to use the Upper Harbor Terminal development to lay bare the failings of the capitalist economy and to build our collective clarity and capacity to do things differently at the Upper Harbor and across the city. We already have a good bit of season 2 completed, and we planned on launching in April in the lead up to a June vote on the Upper Harbor Terminal coordinated plan by City Council, but the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the timeline for the development and thus the show, like it's changed most everybody's timetables in some way, I imagine. There hasn't been a specific revision of the Upper Harbor Terminal process released, but the city has communicated that all April public meetings are suspended, and we don't imagine that they'll be reconvening anytime soon. We are going to continue to track the Upper Harbor Terminal development and make sure that you are informed and engaged in the next steps. But in the meantime, we want to bring our tools to the current moment to cover how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting Minneapolis, how the virus and the response is exacerbating the already untenable race and class inequality in our city. We are going to be releasing episodes in the coming weeks to lift up the incredible ways people in Minneapolis and beyond are providing mutual aid and organizing for revolutionary change in the midst of this pandemic. We're going to be talking about the growing campaign to cancel rent and mortgages in the state of Minnesota. We're going to talk to service industry and restaurant workers organizing in this new reality, to postal workers still out every day getting people the mail they need despite the risk to their own safety, and also despite the all-out attack from neoliberal capitalism and the ruling class's efforts to privatize the post office. We are going to pick up and continue the thread we started in our first COVID episode, the social distancing of Medtronic, following the ways that capitalism has both produced and intensified this crisis. COVID is the virus, capitalism is the crisis. We're going to be switching gears to talk about all that and some more stuff. And on today's episode, we are looking at an urgent issue of housing from an angle that we haven't spent much time on in our discussion of gentrification thus far. Unsheltered homelessness. Ask yourself a simple question. How does someone stay at home if they don't have housing? How can one shelter in place without a place? There are approximately 19,600 people experiencing homelessness in the state of Minnesota today. The violence of our for-profit housing system was unacceptable before COVID hit. And this quarantine, shelter in place only heightens that violence. In a similar way that the capitalist medical tech industry makes billions in profits every year, but cannot produce and distribute an adequate supply of ventilators, masks, or tests. In a similar way that the capitalist health insurance industry makes billions in profits while poor and working people suffer from chronic illness and die of preventable disease. It's in a similar way that the capitalist housing market in Minneapolis has been booming for the last decade. New luxury buildings springing up all around us, while at the same time the number of people experiencing homelessness continues to rise. Over the past few weeks, I've been humbled to witness nurses, outreach workers, neighbors, people experiencing homelessness come together to reduce harm in this moment of crisis, to distribute food, to administer medicine, to protect campsites, and to organize for long-term fundamental change in our approach to health, land, and housing. Some of the demands arising from the ground up are for Governor Tim Walz to use his executive authority to open hotels and other livable unoccupied properties as dignified and safe housing for people experiencing homelessness during this pandemic. While there are 19,600 people without shelter in Minnesota, there are also 82,000 vacant hotel rooms. You do the math. Way more empty housing than we have houseless people. We need to get people into those rooms so they can quarantine safely immediately. Right now, many of the traditional shelters cannot accommodate social distancing, and staff are underpaid, underprotected, and overworked. Another demand being directed at Governor Tim Walz is emergency shelter and housing staff must have healthy and just working conditions. That includes appropriate personal protective equipment. It means a minimum of 2 weeks paid sick time, hazard pay, and an expansion of public employee health benefits to these essential workers. Another target for urgent demands is the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. Minneapolis is unique in that we have a semi-autonomous elected Park and Recreation Board with the power to set public policy. We're not talking about a department of the city government. The Minneapolis Park and Rec Board is governed by a 9-person elected body and is the largest landholder in the city of Minneapolis, with a budget of over $120 million of public dollars a year and its own police force. Think about it, before the shelter-in-place order, people who slept outside used public buildings to access basic hygiene and sanitation, to wash their hands and to use the bathroom. Under the rules of this shelter in place, those buildings are now locked down. So while public health officials are reminding us the importance of washing our hands, they are making it harder for unsheltered people to access the most fundamental health protections. The immediate demand of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board is to make hand washing and sanitation stations available in neighborhood public parks, to allow portable toilets in parks, and to open up bathrooms and shower facilities for people in our neighborhoods who need them. Another demand is that all levels of government must commit to not clearing any camps. That means the state, the county, the city, and the park board. People must be allowed to camp where they are, to shelter in place, and to have their health supported, not to be treated like trespassers or criminals simply for existing on stolen land. I encourage everybody listening to go check out the Facebook page Can't Stay Home Without Housing. Check out Can't Stay Home Without Housing to get more information and to get plugged into the organizing happening around these demands. On today's episode, we have an interview with public health nurse Sarah Jane Keaveny. We talked with Sarah Jane about the acute impacts COVID-19 is having on people experiencing homelessness in Minneapolis. We talked about the role of colonization and white settler society in creating the conditions we find ourselves in today. And we also talked about the cultural and spiritual dynamics of personal and public health. I want to say that this last month has been really challenging for me, like I'm sure it has for many of you. I've been on a roller coaster of anxiety, urgency, fear, exhaustion, grief, hope, confidence, faith, inspiration. I feel like I've ran the whole spectrum. Sitting with Sarah Jane last weekend was grounding. It was a learning moment for me, and her insights and her presence helped me to show up a little better for myself and for others this week. I want to say thank you to Sarah Jane for being willing to share her knowledge and perspective with us, and I want to give a big salute and show love to all the people out there showing up for each other in so many different ways. I really believe we're going to come out of this stronger and more creative. I know that while we're physically distancing, we're also deepening our social solidarity. I know that in my culture, springtime is a time of uprisings. So with no further ado, here's our interview with public health nurse Sarah Jane Keaveny. Welcome, folks. We're here today, changing our regularly scheduled program just a bit to talk about issues connected to the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, issues of inequality and oppression existed before this, and now we're seeing the quarantine change the field a bit. So today we're honored to sit with a nurse and a public health practitioner, Sarah Jane Keaveny. Got it.
It's an old Irish name.
I was wondering, that's what I figured when I read it. Yeah. Do you know, when your family came over?
Yeah. My grandfather's grandfather immigrated from County Cork. He came in through, Philadelphia. He spent a little bit of time and then came straight over to southwestern Minnesota. And that's where my family had a homestead for several generations.
That's the same story of one of my Irish branches. Came through Cork County to Philadelphia, and I think before coming to this neighborhood, we just drove past Holy Name Parish is where my Irish grandparents met.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So Arthur Patrick Keaveny grew up in Renville Falls. That's my grandfather, and that was like the paternal lineage. And then Madonna Heft, she was the nurse in my family, the only medical professional.
Wow.
And they met, my Aunt Louise had a little cafe in Renville County and introduced Arthur and Madonna.
That's amazing. Madonna.
Yeah.
So could you talk about your work as a nurse? And in particular, your work as a nurse with folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Yeah.
I started working at Hennepin County Medical Center when I was 20. I worked in acute psychiatric services. I got a job. I didn't have a degree or anything like that, but a friend of mine worked as a huck, and he got me a job there. And that was the first time that I was really working directly with people experiencing homelessness. And it was curious, I was like this young, I'm white woman, and oftentimes it would be officers who were in highly excited states that would drop somebody off in this hallway with me and ring a buzzer, leave the person, and then take off.
Wow.
And so my first job was starting, as a young person, was de-escalating people who needed psychiatric evaluation. I didn't think I was going to be a nurse. I didn't, despite having my grandmother as a nurse, I didn't know I was going to do nursing, but I was a wilderness field guide for a lot of years, and I worked with adjudicated youth. We went on long expeditions, and then when I found out I was going to be a mom, I came back to Minnesota and went to nursing school at St. Kate's in Augsburg. And ever since that time, I worked again as a nurse in acute psychiatric services, and I've worked alongside kind of mental health and housing for many years, and kind of bringing together what it means to provide healthcare amidst competing needs. Like, people really, when you're not housed and you're not having that kind of like support and security of a house, it's difficult to prioritize healthcare and certainly mental health services. So figuring out like the long game with folks to make sure that we're on the same page. And then a lot of my work has been specifically for folks who are unsheltered, so not accessing Hennepin County's like social service net or sheltered.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about how this new reality we find ourselves in with the pandemic and with the quarantine and the shelter-in-place order, how is that impacting folks who are experiencing homelessness in Minneapolis and impacting your work as a health practitioner?
Yeah. So in the U.S., I think quarantine has a long history of, what do you call it, medicalized violence. Oftentimes we medicalize an issue in order to keep people away or to keep people out. And my fear in this, the idea of quarantine belongs to everyone right now. And it's hard to access the same kind of like support and security in quarantine when you lack housing. So certainly looking at how then do people become viewed as a support to public health or a risk to public health. And I think when we talk about housing and homelessness, that oftentimes becomes where the conversation goes. So some is looking at who's going to be liable to contract the coronavirus or COVID-19, and then who's going to be more susceptible to be spreading that. And I think that that is something that's really curious about what's happening right now in our community. The executive order came into place with the shelter in place. If for many years now, it's been illegal to quote unquote camp. So many times camps have been cleared out, and kind of different rules around that or different interpretations of when you would move a camp or why you would move a camp. And so now the purpose of it is to promote people staying in place, but also with the caveat that if criminal activity or what's viewed as criminal activity or, risk to public health, that can still be in some ways interpreted as a reason to move a camp. So I think for those of us that support people in that kind of like crux of choosing to be camping in our community and staying in place, there's some question of how that's going to be interpreted. And with wanting to give people the guidelines or guidance to be as safe as possible, there's some curiosity about how that will be interpreted, which makes my work difficult because I'm relying on my relationship, and a lot of that is giving good information, being reliable, following through with what I'm saying I'm gonna do. And so if I don't know the information or I don't know how to support someone to be as safe and as healthy as they can be, that makes it much more difficult in the long run. I think we're still right now in the early stages of the virus. It hasn't shown up in too many ways, like right in the like symptomatic people experiencing homelessness that I'm dealing with day to day. I do think that that will be a reality here pretty soon. But right now, I feel like the biggest thing is building relationships and letting people know that I want to know where they are, I want to know how they're doing, and I want them to be safe and well. And then supporting basic needs so that that really comes through in actions, not just in saying that again and again.
Yeah. I've heard you in the last couple of weeks talk about some compounding pandemics that are affecting folks experiencing homeless right now too. Could you just talk about the general condition, like before this pandemic hit, what are the risks and what are the, oppressions people are experiencing, especially through like their health and their wellness, and then how does this pandemic kind of layer on top of that?
Yeah. So the coronavirus pandemic is happening across the world. So the pandemic nature of it is here in the United States, but then in multiple countries. The epidemics that we have here in Minneapolis or Hennepin County have been also focused on public health. We've seen an increase in IV drug users who are contracting HIV. HIV in the last, several decades, the largest, when they look at population health, they look at a population of men who have sex with men as the population who has the highest incidence of new cases of HIV annually in Hennepin County. And that trend is changing. It's no longer specific to men who have sex with men. The highest rate of new cases is now in IV drug users. And many of those folks, also one of the other big indicators is people experiencing homelessness and insecure housing. Similarly, we have another communicable disease, hepatitis A. It's viral hepatitis. So it's not necessarily, there's several strains of hepatitis. Hepatitis A is called fecal oral. So if you have the highest incidence of how it's contracted is if you don't have access to good hygiene, you carry that virus on you. You might be sharing a cigarette, sharing a bottle, eating from the same plate of food, and you can contract that virus. And again, its highest incidence is in unsheltered homeless, housing insecure, and also a higher incidence of folks who are IV drug users or using IV drugs.
Yeah, one thing I've, become more aware of over these last couple of weeks is thinking about the ways that the shelter-in-place order or the closing down of public spaces impacts people. And you talked about the need for hygiene. How is that? From my understanding, it's a lot harder to just wash your hands now if you don't got your own bathroom to go into. Are things like that showing up, access to public space? Yeah. So it's everybody wants to be safe, and I'm not trying to speak against the social distancing, but then just to think about the idea of public space or public buildings, if you could speak on that. And then also, I know that there's some demands arising of what some of the public sectors, some of the layers of local government could do to respond to the needs of homeless folks right now.
So in talking about those two more communicable diseases, folks who lack housing, lack access to consistent housing, oftentimes rely on things like skyways, public restrooms, public libraries, transit, even developing relationships with specific business owners to be able to use bathrooms or facilities, spend time in lobbies or other places where you can quote unquote be invisible. And when all of our public-facing services in Hennepin County closed, skyways closed, businesses closed, transit closed from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., that eliminated a huge resource for folks who lack housing and folks who lack shelter, or that are accessing shelter, because shelters are only open overnight. So those are ways in which our community provides public health protection for folks just in general, having access to restrooms, having access to warmth and shelter, as we go about our days. So that's a huge shift now for folks who have relied on those services. And I think the second part of that question is typically when we see a huge closure or change in services, we notice a resource that the expectation is that when a service goes away, it will be accessed in a different way. So when we're looking at the sheltered homeless population, right now they're trying to eliminate people in congregate settings, so shelters who might spread or contract COVID-19. And so what they did is they moved adults who are 60 and above out of shelter and anyone who is immunocompromised or at high risk for contracting it. So we saw a problem in a service or a resource, the congregate setting of shelter, and wanted to created a new service for folks that were at risk in that service. simultaneously in the unsheltered community, we did not see that. We just saw this huge closure of services without new services or new options showing up. And I think that that's probably the thing that is concerning to me is that when we don't have a service and we aren't telling people where to go to get their basic needs met, then people have to do things by their own, like of their own accord or make their own decisions in order to be safe and well. And that creates a lot more confusion and a lot more, I would say, risk and vulnerability in our community. So I think from that risk and vulnerability comes the next question of like, when people are without basic needs, then what do we need to ask for? And that kind of comes at every different layer right now. Decisions are being made in this emergency response. And that usually the money flows from the federal government to the states to local governments like pretty quickly. I would say the folks that I work with in local government who respond to emergencies, such as these epidemics that I've talked about before, are used to really proactively the federal and the state government releasing funds and turning on services, like coming up with ideas about how to access services or how to create the model that we want people to move through. And very clearly in this epidemic, the folks who knew that it was coming and were needing to plan for it did not get that funding mobility from the top, so from the feds to move into the states, to move into the local economy fast enough in order to really get equipment, make adjustments, make changes to services. And that, I think, is what we're seeing when they just really quickly had to change the social service model, the housing model, all this stuff. Not to say that if we wouldn't have known 2 months prior, it would have we would have been on quarantine or something longer, but we just would have had more chance to be flexible and a little bit more mindful or planful about how those things were going to shift. And that, I think, is what's creating this idea of these really abrupt changes without a lot of planning.
Yeah.
And I think folks who are consistently on the margins are always the last population looked out for. So folks who are unsheltered are a small portion of the population, high vulnerability, high risk, and kind of the last contingency, I would say, when we're making plans for population health.
Yeah. Could you talk a bit about this dynamic, this tension between, like, I don't know you well, but from my experience with you, I see you being somebody who is committed to solidarity, and I watch the way that you've interacted with the folks that you care for, and it's from a humane perspective. It's not like somebody might imagine a public health worker who is disrespectful or see somebody just like a client, like kind of a negative stereotype of a social service provider. But in your position where you're somebody who is, committed to justice, committed to solidarity, and also working as a part of these big systems that are oppressive and are wrapped up inside of like American capitalism. What's that tension like for you, or how are you navigating that? And like, I'm curious about it in this moment. And I guess I'll share, and maybe folks listening to the show, we were planning on talking about this more, I think, in season 2, but I am paid by a nonprofit. Like, that's my day job. I work as a nonprofit, and it so happens to intersect with my political passions and my work as an artist at times. So sometimes, you feel pulled in different ways, or it's just stuck in the middle of a lot of conflict. Could you speak on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like, when you asked if I wanted to be interviewed, it's like, that was the question that came to mind first, is like, how do I both be mindful and protect the people who I care for directly, those relationships that I built with folks experiencing homelessness and really at the margins. How do I be in my own self, like as a person, and then also as somebody who does work, like in healthcare, in these different kind of big systems. And sometimes I have a voice or have some of that leadership. And right now it's this curiosity. I studying myself as a caregiver, like this idea of a professional caregiver, and where did that happen in my life where I started to believe that I had to be a professional in order to give care and take care of other people. What are the barriers that exist right now in systems or in our community, in our collective, where we start convincing ourselves that we don't know how to take care of one another? And this is a really curious time, because right now what I'm seeing in the systems and the structures, kind of these like agencies, is this feeling like we don't know how to take care of each other right now. And on the total antidote side of that is this huge mutual aid that's showing up in the community and the collective. Some people are professionals. Some people have been caregiving a long time, are healers or herbalists, like all these different folks who are showing up with a community care model, who are like, well, we don't have to wait for someone to tell us what to do. We can mobilize resources. We can show up. We can read the CDC guidelines. People need hygiene. People need hand washing. People need food. People need distance. We can support people to do that as best as we can with the resources we have. So it is a time for me, like both as a professional, as a person, to like watch that veil get parted and be able to see it on both sides. Like, what have been the things that have kept people from just caring for people who have been historically unhoused, unsheltered? And what are the barriers that the system keeps creating for itself? It's just it's a time.
It makes me think, one thing I think a lot about healthcare is I'm into like proactively caring for my body and my spirit and my mind. And I very much can be critical of like, definitely the for-profit healthcare system, or you might even say like Western medicine or whatever, I understand that there's like a deeper relationship we have with the planet, and our health is political and social. But then I also am very much an advocate for Medicare for all and a single-payer healthcare system, and recognizing that a lot of times, being in the nonprofit world, you see grants that come down that are for maybe yoga programs or some of these more holistic health models, but I became very cynical and critical of those, because in my view, they're designed to kind of placate people who are barred from accessing like the actual health services that we have. They can't go to the hospital because they can't afford it. So I hear that in kind of the tension that you're saying, where like we do have a responsibility and a power to care for each other, and we have all this public wealth and real needs for like real health care that right now is caught up in this corporate for-profit system. So it's like, how do you do both? I guess it's kind of like communism and anarchism or something,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The system of thought that I've really been exploring right now studies this idea of like technology, science, logic, as like the top of the iceberg. And then like what's underneath that is symbol, mythos, harmonium, kind of these more energetic sort of things. And I think, the Western civilized concepts really lie on that top. And the, instruction that I have is to know both very well. And there is a value in all those things. And the value gets distorted when we aren't recognizing like the base that it's standing on of all of that. So for myself, I really feel like there is a value in medicine. There is a value in knowing anatomy and systems. There's a value in knowing, some of it. But when we rely on the logic and the technology and the science as going to be the whole answer, it makes it so that we have to fragment ourselves from our intuition, our knowing, our collective, the power of relationships and being in community. And that makes it so that when we spend all that time in the science and the technology, it really can be a violence to ourselves and a splitting off of ourselves. And this, again, feels like one of those opportunities. Like, I don't have to ask the people who are showing up with mutual aid why they're there. They're being there means that they're supposed to be there, like that they're showing up. We don't necessarily know. We don't have the answers. We don't have to have all the logic in order to start making the next right decision of how to care for one another. And I think one of the things that everyone would say is, in this pandemic, I think there's a couple things that are really coming to light. The wellness of each of us is so powerful to the wellness of all of us. And I think that used to be this confusing thing when we think about Medicare for all, or we think about access to healthcare. It's like, well, if I can be healthy.
Yeah, why do I got to pay for you? Right?
Yeah, I don't know if everybody needs to be healthy for me to be healthy. But in this situation, it's very clear that everyone's wellness impacts each of our wellness. My wellness impacts everyone's wellness around me, like my ability to do that. And I think this other thing that I'm curious about in whiteness in particular is this idea of never being considered a potential harm to someone else, never being considered like the vector. And I don't know if I shared this with you. My grandmother was one of the first Minnesota deaths of COVID. She died last weekend.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
No, I'm saying that because I feel moving in my family is this idea of like people who had seen her recently, worried that they gave it to her, having seen her, worried that they have been like passing that around or these different things, right?
Yeah.
And my family I love them dearly, but really would not consider themselves a risk to public health. You know, they're not people who feel like they are impacting people negatively or, you know, like that kind of thing. And that's this thing that always creates this confusion for me where, you know, like especially with implicit bias or these different violences, it's like, it's not usually like these really like harsh actions.
Yeah.
It is the impact of things over time. And I think we'll all have time where it hits really close to home, like in our families. And at some point we'll contract COVID-19. A lot of us will. We'll find out that we like maybe exposed someone we cared deeply about or who had a vulnerability, or we'll have that move through our community, like in our like close communities in these ways. And it will change how we interact with feeling like we're a risk or feeling like we put other people at risk. And I think that feeling is something felt in people experiencing homelessness oftentimes, is that feeling of like somebody felt like I was a risk, felt like I was exposing them to something that they shouldn't have to be exposed to. I'm impacting just by being this like dangerous, risky thing. And I think we have so much isolation in different ways in our collective that we don't experience that a lot. And so this different isolation that we're experiencing because of this public health crisis could be a catalyst for some of that change.
Almost a leveling in a spiritual sense where people's perceptions of their place in the order gets changed.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your grandmother or, you know, sending love to you and your family.
Yeah, thanks. Grandma Jojo.
Grandma Jojo. Was she Irish?
Irish and German. Okay. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm wondering, in your time in Minneapolis, in your time working in public health, how have you experienced gentrification in your work? Have you seen the conditions on the ground and the conditions of your work change? And like I think about the last 10 years, 5 years, and my experience has been like the city has changed a lot. Obviously, like the physical landscape has changed a lot. Just curious if you think about that, if you've thought about that, if it shows up in your work with homeless folks.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I kind of talked about this a little bit, like it's important for me as a medical professional and as a white person and as somebody who has a lot of privilege to not shy away from what all of that symbolizes in any interaction that I'm having with people. And so as somebody that is working in healthcare and housing, when I talk about it, I oftentimes talk about my own access to housing. So I've talked about my grandparents a lot. I don't usually do that, but...
We're pro-grandparents over here.
Yeah. So, you know, my mom grew up She was born in 1953. She grew up in a house in South Minneapolis that had racial covenants in it that said that it could only be bought and sold by Caucasian. And there was like very specific language in there about race, but the bottom line is only bought and sold by Caucasian purchasers. My family's land in southwestern Minnesota in Renville County was initially purchased like from the Homestead Act at a time where bounty was happening. And like that means that land came into ownership through displacement, through gentrification, through genocide. And that only people, that were white and then that came into my family's lineage had access to that. Yeah. So I don't have to wonder if my access to housing has changed who I am and how I am. I moved back to Minneapolis as a single parent. I bought a house as a first-time home buyer. I bought here in South Minneapolis. The house was vacant and foreclosed for like several years. I know that historically, like where I lived wasn't owned by people who look like me. But this house that I live in has changed my life and like made it so that I can be a single parent and be in Minneapolis. So I know like in my bones what it means to have access to housing and access to a place. Have I seen a change through gentrification in Minneapolis? Absolutely. Who gets to be where? Who gets to say they're part of even making a place nice? So I worked for a while at People Serving People, which is the family shelter downtown when the real big real estate boom started a little while ago.
And that's right there by like US Bank Stadium and the whole downtown east it's called now.
3rd and 3rd.
Yeah.
And there's always in that ward more vacancies in the new, what do you call it, like developments than there's more vacancies than there are needs for the people who are experiencing homelessness in that ward, like the families that are there. And that to me is just a constant. Every night we know how many people are in shelter. Every night we know how many open units there are. So we are a community that's building for a speculative future. We are building and developing for people who don't yet live here while we are displacing families and people who live here. And that's across the city as well.
Yeah.
And we see that too in the way in which people navigate homelessness. Oftentimes, when there aren't services in the outstate or the same level of services, people move to the metro or move closer into downtown Minneapolis in order to access the few services that are here. And then, as a Minneapolis resident, and specifically like having been in Ward 9 for a long time, seeing how much has changed and how few people have access to housing within their income status and how much that has changed.
Yeah. And I could be wrong. I'm just judging based off of my sensory data, just walking through the neighborhood and walking through the city. It seems to me like there's a correlation between how much of this new luxury, affordable, speculative housing is being built and how many more folks there are sleeping on the street. It's like really just shocking still every day to me to see like these buildings that I know are sitting empty and then see people that I know sleeping on the street.
Right.
It brings me back to that idea of like that you talked about where there's like the technology and the science at the top of the pyramid and then kind of the ideology and spiritual worldview underneath it, where I realize like I have to keep reminding myself like I like architecture. I think these new buildings they're building are very cool. It could be great. My problem is that they're like privately held commodities and they're not designed to provide housing for people. So what it could look like now, and I'm hearing more people even in these last 2 weeks where the reality of the quarantine is hitting people saying like, well, why don't we move people right into these buildings that are sitting empty? And I'm like, yeah, that's a great idea. I think I just got one more question for you. I'm curious if you could talk about like what you do to care for yourself in the midst of providing care to others. Like I've seen you over the last couple of weeks demonstrating leadership and providing care to others and didn't even know that you lost your grandmother, you know, and I'm sure that this is before the COVID hit, something that you have to be mindful of, just being somebody who cares for people and then being somebody who cares for poor people. What's that been like for you, and what are your practices if other folks, you know, my partner is getting ready to start her nursing career, what would you tell somebody?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to that thing that I was talking about before about this idea where I think 10 years ago, it was really hard for me when I was really I guess 15 years ago now, when I was really embedded in more activism and social justice and like kind of the movement work, where it was so hard for me to recognize that my well-being and my ability to just be okay was actually radical and revolutionary. Like there's so much work and there's so much struggle, and like what does Grace Lee Boggs say? Like, what is the time of the world clock right now? You know what I mean? It's like, it's now. Yeah. And it feels that way, especially in this pandemic, right? Like the world clock is saying change is here. And I get to have really close relationships with elders. I get to have a cultural community. I am doing a cultural self-study to like recognize myself as a caregiver and like where my place in creation is. And I think I've always known that I can care for people and want to care for people, and that I have this like sturdy ground, and that I have like access to that despite, different challenges or things that I've been through in my life. And being able to like be in that and be the symbol of all those things, I think does, if I can hold both, then that's where I feel like that strength and resiliency comes from. I want to be able to like, I'm a single parent. I want to be able to like, when I'm with my kid, laugh and have joy and be fully in that. I want to be able to not have the experience of caring for other people who are, in the margins, be something that doesn't have like the levity and the movement that it really does. Like the most heartening part of my work is being with people and connecting with them and recognizing that I'm in community. I'm not there to fix anything or, be the savior. I'm there to just be along with what's happening and keep being my whole self. I do try to sit for 20 minutes a day. I do try to show up in my relationships that, have been with me my whole life. And, and I just keep finding wayfinders, like the lights along the path that keep telling me that I'm going in the right way.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Hey, well, thank you so much for sitting with us today.
Yeah.
It was really cool to talk with you.
Yeah, this was great.
Hell yeah, definitely. Reporting from a South Minneapolis garage with a public health nurse.
At the hearth.
At the hearth, right. Sarah Jane Keaveny. All right. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see.